Out the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune into Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. No surrender.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. I'm going to give a quick note here. Again, if you want to call in, you can. 202-521-1320 is the number to call. However, if you want to listen, not necessarily call, if you want to listen and for some reason you're simultaneously listening now and not, and you want to know where you can listen to us more or better, you can on the air in DC, 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. Also, if you're in Kansas City, 102.9 and 104.7 FM, also 1140 AM. That setup for that was admittedly a little bit confusing, but you get the contradiction here. I'm telling people where they can listen to us while they're listening to us, undoubtedly. Maybe, but here's the thing, though. I've thought about this a little bit before. Maybe they're listening to a pre-record, not a pre-record, but, one of our live shows after it's been posted on YouTube or one of these other platforms. And if they're in the DC area or the Kansas City area, I guess it's just helpful to remind them, hey, you can listen to us live, too. So that's the justification there. Regardless, also, here's the other side of it. If you want to listen to us online, you can. Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, YouTube, like I just mentioned. We're also live on Periscope now over on Twitter, twitter.com/faultlinesradio. We have a bunch of platforms you can check us out on, and hopefully you are, and I would say you should. And with that, we're moving into an open segment. Oh, man, take it over for a second, Jamarl. I am breathless.
Yeah, so apparently I'm just now coming online. That's fine. That was my fault. But nevertheless, we were talking about we were having a conversation basically about the drug laws. And this notion that if Joe Biden look, when I make this point, that there's something problematic about the blue no matter who stuff and the you have nowhere to go stuff, it's part and parcel to this. Basically, a man can run in a race where once he gets rid of the competition to his left, at that point, you have no tethers on him. And with the notion that Donald Trump is a maniac, they would argue that you have no choice to vote for Joe Biden, but that also means that Joe Biden can do whatever Joe Biden wants. And Joe Biden, despite the fact that the overwhelming majority of the public is like, yeah, pot should be legal. And yeah, the notion that we're putting people in prison or getting them hooked on some kind of prison thing, or even engaging with the cops in this case, is problematic and leads to disastrous outcomes, not to mention disparate outcomes in regards to racial demographics. And then when you make the point that much more clear that Nixon basically started the drug war to lock up blacks and hippies, literally, oh man, then that gets that much worse when Joe Biden turns around and is like, yeah, thanks for the 90% support, but no, we're still going to keep these drug laws on the books the way they are. Tarif from New Orleans. What's going on, Tarif?
Well, good morning, gentlemen, and happy payday, right? I have three hello? All right.
Yeah, go ahead.
I have three comments this morning. Two comments dealing with the high wire. I was watching them yesterday. You had a whistleblower was on it yesterday, and you had a congressman named, well, he's not a whistleblower, but he was a congressman named Roger Krishnamurti, a congressman out the Midwest on the House Committee on Oversight and Reform. He was talking about the problems with the COVID-19 test kits and how they're not being regulated, how these companies starting up trying to make these test kits quickly to make money. So they come back with false positives and false negatives, and then when they come back positive, what does that mean? Because you have other type of coronaviruses out there as well. So that's the first comment, and that's at the 10-minute, 25-second mark on the High Wire show. The second one dealing with the whistleblower from Utah named Judy Zimmerman. She blew the whistle on the CDC and with some other place.
He dropped.
Tarif? Oh, okay. Well, I am not shocked in the least that there is a capitalistic incentive to maximize profit on an item that they're trying to get out as fast as possible. What Trump should have did was basically use the Defense Production Act to get these companies to produce this stuff and gave them a certain cost or a certain amount that they was going to pay them. But the idea that these guys are just pumping this stuff out in order to maximize their profit at the expense of other people. And again, the moment that you're cranking this stuff out like this at this kind of fast rate, well, the whole the point of being accurate sometimes matters less. And I think that's always the problem with stuff like this. Thank you, Tarif. I got to be honest, the same thing about the vaccine. One of the things that came up about the vaccine was that they were considering testing it on African Americans because of the high disparity in the number of blacks that were dying and Hispanics that were dying in comparison to whites. Now, think about what this means for the moment. That means that they're coming up with a vaccine, something that they're not sure is going to work or not, and they're like, hey, let's test it on this group. African Americans should not put themselves up to be guinea pigs for this kind of test kit or anything else. So, yeah, I feel you, man. There's always this incentive for profit. I think the same way about cold vaccines, cold inoculations or flu inoculations. It was like, hey, get this flu inoculation year after year after year, and there's no way to test the efficacy of it as a person. You kind of just have to trust on faith that these companies that are built for profit are just so happen looking out for your best health interests.
We should get somebody on. Sorry for interrupting. We should get somebody on vaccines at some point. That seems like one of these intensely politicized issues where there's the truth is somewhere in the middle. Where, as far as I can tell from a bird's eye view, there's the denialist camp or whatever, and then there's the really pro-vaccine camp. As far as I can tell, it's not like every vaccine is going to be dangerous. It's like but it's neither the case that every vaccine is dangerous nor that every vaccine is safe. And you should have that kind of nuanced conversation. It's interesting, the areas that get politicized. Tarif is back, though, by the way. We should probably bring it back on the air so we can finish what he was saying.
Wait, just to make a real quick point. I agree with you that it's somewhere in the middle. It's if you are giving your kid a vaccine for, I don't know, polio, great, no issue. I think it's the flu vaccines that they just seem like year after year after year, it just seems to be so monetized. Tarif, welcome back. I'm sorry. Let me let you finish your point.
Oh yeah, I had dropped off. Okay, I have two other comments. The second comment is dealing with the Howard show. You had a whistleblower named Judy Zimmerman, PhD, from out of Utah, and she said she was studying the increased rates of autism dealing with children at the ages of 8. That started in 2006 when she saw an increase with it. And she thinks that either the CDC or somebody else was manipulating the data because the state of New Jersey had the highest rates of autism, and it went from 134 from every 34 children born, and 1 out of 134 children born to 1 out of 120 children born, of males. That's an increase. And she says it's like she said that's really an epidemic, and she was willing to testify. Her name is Judy Zimmerman, PhD. She's a scientist. That's at the 30-minute mark on the Howard show. My last comment is dealing with me. I'm a whistleblower. Mikey DeBakey water was contaminated to work there. I posted up an article with the Southeastern Texas written about me, about my case, and I put it underneath y'all link for today, and also for the Howard too. Underneath y'all link for today. I was looking for H.A. Goodman interview with me from 3 years ago. YouTube deleted it. So hopefully he can find it and he can repost it or give it to me, and I can give it to y'all Monday. So that's all I want to say. And thank y'all for letting me call back in this to finish my comments.
Hey, thank you for calling back in, Tarif. Yeah, we've got to go to some other callers pretty quickly here because we've got a few on the line. But I just also want to briefly note, yes, Tarif, you've been calling in for a while. We've been talking about this whistleblower thing. Like you were saying, folks, if they want to learn more about this, you can check out on Twitter. He posted a link to the Southeast Texas Record. It's an article back from 2016 where Tarif was talking about basically in the VA, in a Veterans Administration medical center in Houston. He was a boiler technician, and he saw all sorts of water problems. So maybe we can have you on sometime. I know you and Garland were talking about coming on back in the day, and then this whole fracas started, and that kind of fell by the wayside. But regardless, I'd love to have you on to talk about that. We also have other callers that I think we should get to. I'm not sure if I'm reading this right. Dane from the area here. Are you on the line?
Oh, Diane.
Diane. There we
What's
go.
going on?
Yeah,
Diane, how's it going?
Morning.
Good morning.
How you doing, Jamal? Hey, Shane. I don't have anything in particular to say. I just want to say I have thoroughly enjoyed the show. and keep up the good work. And Shane, I have one thing to say to you. You have done well, this being your first time hosting a show. And I thoroughly enjoyed it yesterday, but you were pushing back. And the people do enjoy you pushing back at Jamarl. So keep up the good work.
Thank you for that. That is, should I give away? Thank you, Diane. Thank you. I'm sorry for getting your name wrong. That was lost in translation there. But thank you for saying that. Jamarl, do you want to say who that is, or should we just move over?
Oh, that's my mom. Yeah. Hey,
There we
people who
go.
are on the show, they know. Yeah, that's my
Okay,
mom.
there we go. Cool. All right. Yeah.
So we also have Bob from DC. But right, and thank you for calling, and I appreciate it. And yeah, she always says Shane needs to talk more. Shane needs to talk more. So when you were pushing back yesterday, she was like, "Yeah, the Shane is getting it. Shane's getting it." We have Bob from DC. Bob, what's going on?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, hello. Yeah, thank you for taking my call. A couple of things. First of all, I am not voting for Biden. He recently came up with such, I'm sorry to use this for stupidity, to say that Trump is not doing enough to unseat Nicolas Maduro, the rightful president, constitutional president in Venezuela, and that he recognizes or should recognize Guaidó, whatever. Everybody, the Europeans, the UK, and everybody else around in the United States are stealing the funds, the money, the gold from Venezuela. Citgo, the companies that run and the gas stations in the United States, Citgo, which we used to go and fill up our tanks, the gas, they were taken over by the U.S. and handed over to the Guaidó. Who the hell is Guaidó? I'm sorry to use this word. Who is this man? He's nothing. He just said, "I am the president," like somebody here preaching up. Say, "I am the president," because Trump is not, whatever. Okay, so, and they recognize him. But Biden is doing this. So at least Trump is a natural, fake, a natural, a crazy man. Biden pretends to be normal. And that's not correct. So I'm not voting. What is this going to happen? I don't know. But I tell you this, to you and to the audience, what Bernie Sanders was saying, and this will take care of coronavirus, the economy, the race issue, and everything. Come out and vote by the millions. That's what he said. Population uprising or movement, but not for Biden. Who's going to do that? So they can even select, pick up, draft, whatever, somebody else, Jesse Ventura, Bernie Sanders, and whomever. That's one point. The other point, if I'd like you to address quickly, if possible, I miss the other guys as well. You're good, but I miss the other ones. Now, I'm not sure why they were taken out. Is this censorship from your side? Fill the glass in here. Thank you, and please, I'm listening.
Oh, thank you, Bob. I appreciate the call.
Yeah, Bob, thank you for the call. Yeah, this had been building up for a while, and then I'll just come out and say it. I don't even know. I don't know if I'm technically supposed to say this, but I'll just say it. They got fired. This was a long building thing where they had this like deep personal conflict, and there was a lot of political stuff that was going on in the news that was leading to that too. But this had been happening for months and months and months, arguably about a year, but it had really gotten excruciating recently. So it's not censorship. It had nothing, as far as I can tell, to do with the views that either of them were expressing. It was all about the relationship and the breakdown of the relationship. Real quick, though, we've got to go. We've got one caller, only about a minute to take this call, I think. But regardless, let's try it. David from Texas, you're on the line. What is on your mind?
I'm going to try to do this in a minute. Yes, sir. I hear a lot about slave reparations, but I never hear a lot about funding slave reparations. And, looking at the Civil War, the population of America was about 10% of what it is now. You had about 650,000 soldiers, maybe 350,000, a million people dead. What I'm saying is I'll give a 50-year jubilee from Gettysburg right to the creation of the central bank and the income tax of 1913 as a starting point. And then look at records and facts on the accumulation of wealth since the beginning of the central banking method of when they started that, they pretty much did away with 40 acres and a mule is what I'm saying. So it has to be done through some kind of way like that. And I'd like to see the accumulation of wealth since that and who's benefited. The oligarchs then, the oligarchs now. That's about it, fellas.
Thank you. That's interesting comments there. We've got to go into a break in just a second here. I mean, real quick, with the issue of reparations, one of the big issues there is what form exactly that's going to take. If it's direct cash transfers, there's some advantages to direct cash transfers. The problem with that is that it's mutable, it's temporary. It can just sort of flow away. People spend it and suddenly it's gone. So this question, again, you were talking about 40 acres and a mule, promise made following the Civil War, never came to pass. That would have been fixed wealth. That would have been something that would have, sustained families. Even if they sold it off, there's a certain amount of permanence there that you can count on. That kind of thing really does appeal to me. But how are we going to pay for it? I don't know. Super big financial crunch. We've had guests on talking about modern monetary theory, but then there are these still these questions about how other countries are going to see our efforts. Regardless, we should go into a break. Maybe we can continue this, although we're going to be changing topics, I think, talking about the Oklahoma decision. But we'll see. Talking with Joe Loria in this next segment. We'll be back in a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient
I don't have Joe. He's not picking up.
outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history. This week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, specifically Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We're continuing this conversation. We're still trying to get Joe Loria on the line. That gives us a minute or two, a little bit of space possibly, to have this conversation. We're having at the end of the break about reparations, the exact form that reparations could take, how we're going to afford that, this whole issue. I said some stuff there, Jamarl. I sort of briefly traced out a few opinions. What's your take on this issue?
I think reparations are complicated. I mean, I think you have a point with the cash payment stuff. I mean, there's a difference between wealth versus just cash. And like you said, if this had taken place with 40 acres and a mule, then over the course of hundreds of years, then it would have, went a particular way. But now it becomes, all right, how do you do that in a way that is not fleeting? And look, cash payments may be the simplest, most straightforward way where from this point on, this being a demarcation point, people can build wealth going into time. So I agree with you on that. I think that's a fair point in regards to what form, how does it look? Is it earnestly reparations? For example, affirmative action was supposed to be reparations of sorts. And more white women use that than blacks. Like, to put it in perspective, right? So it's like whatever form it takes, it should be specific to the people who basically were the descendants of slaves. One caveat. Part of my reason for my consternation for being against it at one point, meaning the dispensation of it as opposed to more universal programs, had to do with what I thought would be a backlash. I thought if you have a situation where you have, let's say, the majority of people on welfare are white, just this, and that means the majority of people who are poor are white, even though the poverty of blacks may be more desperate of sorts at times, and it may be a legacy associated with it. But if you bring up one segment of your population, would it create a backlash in the other? I think the answer is yes. Now, somebody could say, well, you shouldn't care about the backlash. But from just the interaction standpoint, you kind of have to, right? You can't just ignore that more than anything else. So I do think it's somewhat complicated. But that said, it is owed. And even if it's want to be given at the same time you give like a universal basic income for everybody else to balance that out, however it needs to be done, it should be done. I am sick of the racial conversation. And it seems that the sticking point to that racial conversation boils down into the economics. I mean, I don't know another way around it, if I'm being bluntly honest. Oh, by the way, there is something I want to talk about, though. The caller, the last caller it sounded like he was from Venezuela. He made a really interesting point. I've had conversations with people from Venezuela, and they've been very clear that we are lying about them. They've said before, they was like, you're lying about our country. You guys are lying about our country. Now, his reasoning goes down to this notion of Maduro and whether or not Maduro was elected. Well, the fact is Maduro was elected. The United States just didn't like the fact that Maduro was in office. I mean, if you remember, they had Chavez with a gun to his head about to blow his brains out until all those people kind of just flooded the streets. And so, yeah, so all those people kind of flooded the streets. But something else he needs to know, though, us trying to steal the oil, steal the money, which we are from the UK. We're stealing the money that was supposed to be for Venezuela to, for stealing it from their government. But we're also doing that to Syria. I mean, we've gotten to the point where we're stealing oil, and it's not like Syria is a major oil producer. Syria, basically, that oil that they're producing in that area is basically for the country itself. But they also destroying the grain, which is a war crime. Like this, like we've become, this is like a level of banditry that is breathtaking that I don't think I've seen before in regards to the way the United States has behaved by its affairs. And Joe Biden went further to the right on Trump on both of these issues. So, when that caller made the point, I'm not voting for Joe Biden because of Joe Biden's policies, I think that's a fair point for him to make, especially if he's directly related or directly associated with the country that Joe Biden is basically threatening in this way. What do you think?
Yeah, well, it's some of this stuff is a little bit hard to trace back. Maybe the beginning of the 20th century, you see some moves with Teddy Roosevelt. You see some moves with FDR, potentially Woodrow Wilson, arguably more Woodrow Wilson than FDR. FDR was more of an at-home guy. But this move towards more international policy, this move towards overseas policy, again, colonization of the Philippines,
Yes.
the sort of early international step overseas. And then through the course of the 20th century, it increases. That the degree to which our economy and our political mindset is bent on extending ourselves in different ways overseas just increases almost inexorably until the last decade, basically. Until the last decade, when the pendulum seems to have sort of come to a brief rest and then started to shift back in the opposite direction. Now, the consequences of that are going to be huge, not just on our economy, but also on our political mindset. And I think it's like there's this, in some way, we haven't needed real leadership for the last, say, 60, 70 years. We haven't needed it in the sense that our country had all of this fuel, all of this sort of built up military capacity, built up state capacity, all these different things that it could just live on like you're living on your retirement. Of course, the problem with that is that you get this degradation of your political institutions, you get this shift in the basis of the economy, you get all these follow-on problems that we're only now having to really come to grips with. Because again, it seems to be very close at this point to reaching its breaking point. So I'm going to actually tie this back into reparations for a second, just because it fits in with what I was thinking about that. We need those new leaders. We need that new political mindset. I don't see it clearly. I see some of the forms that it could take, but from this sort of high up level, looking at this stuff, that's going to be really exciting. If you think about not living in a country with real leadership for your entire life, the fact that you wouldn't have had to, that it wouldn't have worked, what's it going to be like when we start to see that happen? It's going to be exciting. It's going to be a little bit frightening for a lot of people. It's going to be all these different things. And there are going to be a lot of different kinds of people. It's not going to be one thing. And it could go in so many different directions. It could be good leadership, whatever that means, or bad leadership. It could take us in a more positive direction, or it could just, sustain the current problems, sort of mask the current problems, be a sort of false epiphany. All these different ways it could go. I'd love to get into that. I'd love to start having those a little bit more detail in the conversations about that issue. The problem is that it's all sort of vague right now because, again, we're still living in the incumbent status quo. We're still living in this time. That's my take.
No, that's a good point. I agree with you. I agree with all that. It will be terrifying to a lot of people to see. I mean, look, if we think back, FD during the 30s, you had a Great Depression, you had all sorts of calamity going on around the world. And you had the United States take one specific pivot point, meaning an FDR direction, and you had Germany taking another. It's scary, right? I mean, when things change, they turn into something else. But it's a new reality and a new norm, and that new norm is exciting. And at some point, we need to shake ourselves loose from the way our political system is operating right now. And I guess, like you say, I don't know what that looks like later on. So, but we do have a caller. We have Stephen Lindman on the line. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Oh, Jamarl, Shane, I'm not certain which one I'm talking to, but to both of you, good to be on with you.
Absolutely, thank you. So let's have a conversation about the rising numbers and the situation.
Wait, also, just real quick, Jamarl, I just want to. My voice, the voice you hear now is Shane. The voice you just heard is Jamarl. So you're talking to both. Just to put the guy who's laughing there, that's Jamarl. Just to make sure we're all good here. But thank you. Sorry for interrupting, Jamarl, and thank you for joining us, Stephen.
No, you're fine. So I want to talk about the rising numbers and the China situation, meaning what has been taking place in regards to what it seems like are moves where they may be stealing money from China. Can you explain this? There's something going on in regards to the way the United States is looking to put sanctions, I guess, on China for the Hong Kong situation and using that as somewhat of a pretext to potentially, maybe you could explain it better than I could, either take the money or create a pretext for them to kind of withdraw or to sanction money coming from China, China's banks. Am I explaining this correctly?
Well, the U.S. invents whatever pretext fit the situation to do whatever it wants to do. They have no relation to the rule of law, what's right or wrong or anything else. The U.S. simply goes after the countries the U.S. targets, and China and Russia and Iran top the list. Certainly others as well. All countries the U.S. does not control are on its target list for regime change. Well, I mean, you can wage wars with countries like Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan, which the U.S. has not won. The U.S. has not won a war since World War II ended, but that certainly doesn't deter them from waging them. The idea is to wage them, not win them, because the military-industrial complex does not profit from winning or losing. It profits from waging. So this is why all this stuff goes on. I talk about wars by hot and other means against China, Russia, Iran. They're by other means, not hot means. But the issue with China is the one country in the world that threatens U.S. preeminence. China is rising economically, industrially, technologically. The only thing where the U.S. has a major lead over China is militarily, and probably over time that lead is narrowing. Certainly the U.S. has a lead technologically, but China is gaining, and in the years ahead, there's no question whatever that China will be the world's leading economy. Well, that idea does not go down well in Washington, so China became public enemy number one to the U.S. Why? Well, it has nothing to do with any threat posed by China. I mean, China is not planning to attack the U.S. It's not planning to do anything unlawful to the U.S. Its crime, quote unquote, is it's growing too fast. It's expanding too much. It's threatening U.S. hegemony, and that is the prime sin of any nation against the U.S. So it's imposing sanctions and other hostile actions against China. All U.S. sanctions that are unilaterally imposed are illegal. There's nothing legal about them. Only the Security Council can impose sanctions legally. So all the other nations of the world that go along with U.S. sanctions, unilaterally imposed, are complicit with wrongdoing. Well, the sanctions on China are all about wanting to put it down, wanting to undermine the country economically, industrially, technologically, ideally militarily. That's much harder to do. That's what it's all about, and they're going on. And all the reasons that are used are invented. There's nothing legitimate about them. There's nothing legal about them. They're all invented. They could be anything. It could be over Hong Kong. It could be over things going on in the South China Sea, which is what I wrote about in my last couple of articles, also Hong Kong. It could be anything else. All of this stuff is invented. It has no legitimacy whatsoever, and it's very serious. I mean, there are people in China calling from delinking the two countries. In other words, things have gone too far. They believe there's no possibility that the relationship will be restored to anything close to normality. So they call for simply walking away from the U.S. and China going its own way and developing its own interests. Well, I don't know if China can do that or not. I mean, maybe longer term it can. A part of it is delinking from the dollar. I would think that China can do that. I'm not an expert on that topic, but maybe China can do that. But U.S. industry is located en masse in China. I mean, U.S. industry absolutely does not want a delinking. The only thing it's concerned about is profit making, sales and profit making. So they want good relations between the U.S. and China, but the U.S. wants hegemony, and that's made the relations dismal, getting worse all the time. Is it possible there could be a war between both countries? The prospect is very highly unlikely, but I use the expression time and again that no matter what's likely or unlikely, anything
Stephen, let me
possible.
interrupt you for one moment. Let us take a break, and we're going to bring you back in the very next segment. We have Stephen Lindeman, analyst on geopolitical affairs and author. We'll be back in a moment. This is Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No, it's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, I mean, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
And we are
Welcome
back.
back.
You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're joined now by Stephen Lindeman. He's an author and geopolitical analyst. Also, you can find his work on his website, stephenlenman.org. That's STEPHENLENDMAN, Lendeman, stephenlendeman.org. Regardless, thank you for joining us again, Stephen. Thank you for being with us. I actually had a quick sort of follow-up. We went out, you were talking about the prospects of potential war. You thought it might not be likely. I'm afraid that I see it as likely, and it has to do with this idea. There's this phrase, the Thucydides Trap.
Thulesian.
I first heard it.
No, I thought it was Thucydides. Yeah, Thucydides Trap. That's it. Yeah. I'm sorry.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, back in 2017, there was this book that this guy wrote about it. I'm pretty sure the term predates that, but he might have coined it. Regardless, it refers to this older concept. A very simple way to put it would be when one great power threatens to displace another, war is almost always the result. Specifically, it has to do with a quote here from the great historian Thucydides, who wrote, quote, "It was the rise of Athens and the fear that this instilled in Sparta that made war inevitable," end quote. I see both of those things at play here. I see it, like you're saying, an ascendant China, and then on our end, I definitely see fear. I see a lot of, at the very least, caution. You know, you can only see fear to some extent when people are so guarded about what they actually think is going to happen. But I do see the U.S. acting in all these ways that indicate fear on their part. I see this. I see the potential for this, and that prospect, of course, is terrifying, because again of the nuclear scale, the global scale of conflict, and the potential for great fallout, both literally and figuratively. What's your take on that, Stephen? Why are you more optimistic about this stuff?
Well, no, I'm not optimistic. I think the one difference between the Thucydides trap analogy is that there has never been a war between the two nuclear powers. Two nuclear powers that can decimate the territory of each other. I mean, China has long-range ballistic missiles that could turn my city of Chicago to smoldering rubble. I mean, that prospect does not sound too enticing to me. And the U.S., of course, could do the same thing to Chinese cities. It doesn't mean that war is impossible, because, again, I mean, time and again, wars can happen. We had 2 world wars. Neither one of them should have happened, but they did. So there was a lot of accidental and deliberate stuff that went on that made those 2 wars possible. World War I was really was more accidental. One country got into it with another, and then the allies on either side started jumping in, and we had a world war, and 25 million people. A generation of youth, I think was an expression I once used, a generation of youth, about 25 million people, were wiped out because of that war. And World War II was more than twice as bad. I've seen different numbers of world casualties. I mean, Russia alone, Soviet Russia alone, lost about 25, 26 million people, maybe 50 million people around the world. Just absolutely devastating. And yet to this day, it's called the good war. There's nothing remotely good about it. If we had two world wars, and I've said it myself, there is certainly a possibility there can be a third. And there's no question that the U.S. rage for global hegemony could make anything possible. If the U.S. cannot achieve its aims by all the other tactics it uses, then brute force is the bottom line for the U.S. And we can see it with all these wars that are raging, the ones that have raged throughout the post-World War II period, the ones that are ongoing now that most people pay no attention to. They don't realize that the U.S. is at war in Syria, in Afghanistan, in Yemen. Yemen is not a Saudi war. Yemen is a U.S. war begun about 2 weeks after Afghanistan in October 2001 by Bush Cheney. It was a drone war by Obama, a drone war by Trump, much more than the previous two administrations. And of course, we get the Saudis that are waging war on Yemen. But all this stuff is going on. There's intermittent war in Iraq that's going on. The war in Libya, can't leave that one out. And war in Somalia is going on. We see nothing about this in the U.S. major media. So is there a war possible between the U.S. and China, the U.S. and Russia, the U.S. and Iran? It is absolutely possible. I mean, I explain that going this far would be madness. But madness might never deter the U.S. from going after the aims it wants to achieve. So certainly, it is a very strong possibility that I hope certainly won't happen, because it could be the end of all of us if it does.
Yeah, I mean, to make Shane's point, I guess that much more clear, you mentioned the First World War, saying that it was kind of this calamity where all of these countries kind of tumble into the war. But wouldn't that be a good example of Thucydides' gap, where you have the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, who wants to basically put Serbia underfoot. Serbia is getting too uppity. And so this empire basically wants to look for a reason to come up with a justification to curb it. And the killing of Archduke Ferdinand was a pretext. I mean, from my understanding, even going into the demands that were being made, they gave demands that they knew could not be met, which basically allowed them to come up with a pretext to go after Serbia in this way, creating basically the calamity of a war when all of these powers just kind of jump in and fall in line. Mistakes, I think, is the catch. And I think that's the problem. I think your argument is basically, look, they wouldn't rationally go into it. But like you said, many of these wars don't happen out of rational intent. It happens because it has expectations and brinksmanship that it basically misappropriates, meaning it gets it wrong. Are we wrong on that front? Like, what's... Just so we're very clear what we're talking about here. In China, basically, they are talking about Chinese state lenders are revamping contingency plans in anticipation of U.S. legislation that could penalize banks for serving officials who implement the new national security law for Hong Kong, sources at 5 financial institutions said. In worst case scenario, under consideration by the Bank of China and industrial and commercial banks of China, the lenders who are looking for the possibility of being cut off from the U.S. dollars or losing access to U.S. dollar settlements, 2 sources say. That's mind-blowing, because if my understanding is correct, China has a ton of money built in dollars. And they're basically saying, if I'm reading this correctly, that they are going to in some way try to cut these banks off. What would be the effect of this? If the United States went through this, and they went through with sanctions on China, what would be the response, either from global lenders or from other countries around the world for that matter? Or for that matter, what would China's response be? I mean, they would retaliate. They're not necessarily going to just take that sitting down.
Well, it's a very, very serious situation. And I must say both parties, the GOP and the Dems, they are very, very hostile to China. Whether Biden, if he succeeds Trump next January, will go at China the same way that Trump is doing it, I don't know. I mean, Obama's Asia pivot was establishing a stronger U.S. military footprint in the Asia Pacific, and now it's called the Indo-Pacific. That was his main strategy. It could be. I mean, Biden was with him for 8 years. It could be Biden will continue that strategy and may not want to do anything that will disrupt economic relations too much, because U.S. industry depends on it so much. I mean, some U.S. companies will relocate from China to someplace else, but there are very strong economic ties between the U.S. and China that have built up over decades. Not just unravel that stuff overnight. And U.S. industry would be apoplectic about that great disruption. It would hurt their bottom line, and I'm certain stuff that we never hear about is that their lobbyists are expressing great concern about U.S. relations with China. They don't want their good business being disrupted. That's what they're concerned about. But anything can happen. You start doing one thing, it can lead to others, and things can expand exponentially. And China is taking its own actions to protect itself. There's no question that China does not want a war with anybody. China wants good relations with other countries, but it's not going to sit back and let itself be beaten across the ears in every other way by the U.S. It will respond. I support China's national security law. I mean, it's nothing compared to the U.S. national security laws, the ones I'm familiar with by Bush, Cheney, and then Obama and Trump. And there were provisions in all three of those that assert the right of the U.S. to use nuclear weapons against any other country, including non-nuclear ones, at the discretion of the U.S. Now, that's pretty serious business. There's nothing remotely like that in China's national security law. So who should be criticized?
And just so we're very clear, Stephen, the attacking and killing Americans abroad. I mean, Obama created an affirmative justification to basically be able to kill Al-Awlaki abroad in another country, despite the fact that he wasn't necessarily charged with any crime under our laws, not to mention going even further to kill his kid. Like, that's extreme. Now, if China did a drone strike in Texas, we would be apoplectic over that. And yet we look at their law and we were like, look at that national security law that China is doing. I'm not for or against the law. I don't have any feelings about it because I don't live there. And I think that's kind of the thing, right? We are looking at policies that they take as a nation and almost ignoring the fact that we have similar policies, if not more extreme policies, in the way that we act functionally. I mean, look at what we did to Julian Assange. We asserted a right to basically go get somebody that is not even a U.S. citizen and make him applicable to our laws. And we're complaining about China's law. That just seems so out there. It just seems outlandish. If you are looking at anything right now, what is the thing that is on your mind as being one of the major pivot points that the world or that this country is not talking about, that we should be talking about, that seems to be coming to a head anytime soon in regards to international politics?
Well, I think the thing that concerns me, aside from the possibility of another global war, which would concern me most of all, I certainly don't think that's imminent. If it happens, it's not imminent. But the thing that concerns me most of all is what's going on domestically. The combination of COVID-19 outbreaks creating economic collapse in the U.S. that's affected tens of millions of Americans, maybe half the working age population. The greatest economic collapse in the history of the country with no imminent solution to this thing, and nothing about it is natural. Everything going on was planned by dark forces in Washington. It's part of continuation and expanding the greatest ever wealth transfer in human history from ordinary people to super rich ones in the U.S., along with major businesses, major U.S. corporations getting rid of competition to enhance their power. This is the number one thing on my mind, aside from the risk of global war, which would absolutely wipe out any other concern. That would be the major one if it happens. But the devastation in the U.S., I was born during the Great Depression. I was too young to understand what was going on. But I do remember that my dad had a job, and he brought home an income. And as far as I could understand, when I began to understand anything in the 1930s, things were fairly normal for us. Then World War II came along. But what's going on now far exceeds the excesses of that. I don't know how this thing is going to end. I do know that the harm that's been done to ordinary people will continue for a very long time. It's creating a much greater U.S. permanent underclass of tens of millions of people in the world's richest country. The economy is in collapse. I just wrote about Brooks Brothers collapsing, established in 1918, the famous clothing. I'm sorry, 1818, over two centuries, and now it's out of business, along with tens of thousands of other businesses. And
Stephen, thank you for joining us. A lot to talk about here. Hopefully we can get you back on soon. Thank you also for joining us on such short notice. Really appreciate it. We have 2 more great hours coming up. We'll be back in just a minute to talk about a lot more. We're going to be talking with Joe Laurie at 8:15, Daniel Lazar at 8:30, then Ben Swan at 9:30. Regardless, we'll be back in just a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Listening to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation of propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am former ex-risk researcher and current investigative radio show host, Shane Stranahan.
You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's do some headlines. In the news, the Supreme Court has recognized most of the eastern half of Oklahoma as falling under Native American jurisdiction in a landmark ruling which will change the jurisdiction of criminal cases in much of the state. The court's opinion, Neil Gersh, wrote that on the far end of the Trail of Tears was a promise. Forced to leave their ancestral lands in Georgia and Alabama, the Creek Nation received assurances that their new lands in the West will be secure forever. Today, we're asked whether the lands in these treaties promised remains an Indian reservation for the purposes of federal criminal law. Because Congress has not said otherwise, we hold the government to its word. Head explode. That's an amazing ruling. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. Florida and Texas have each reported their highest 24-hour fatality count for COVID-19, with 120 deaths in Florida yesterday and 105 in Texas. Texas was also reported its 10th consecutive day in new highs in hospitalizations related to COVID-19. In Mississippi, the state's 5 largest hospitals said they ran out of ICU beds midweek. Spikes in Nevada are causing Governor Steve Sisolak to close bars and restaurants in certain counties. In a split decision, the Supreme Court has ruled that while Congress won't be allowed access to Trump's tax returns, New York City prosecutors will. Manhattan attorney Cyrus J. Vance argued President Trump's documents were needed to determine if financial records had been doctored to cover up hush money payments to 2 women in 2016 who said they had affairs with him. Minutes after court's decision, Trump tweeted that this is all political prosecution, quote unquote. President Trump's former personal attorney, Michael Cohen, has returned to federal prison after a dispute over home confinement. After being moved to home confinement in May over fears of the spread of coronavirus, the Federal Bureau of Prisons said he has refused the conditions for his home confinement. An attorney for Michael Cohen said he refused to comply with the condition relating to media and publishing books. Cohen has been convicted of financial crimes, campaign finance violations, and lying to Congress. Walt Disney World in Florida is reopening its theme park this weekend for the first time since this closed in March 15th, with Magic Kingdom and Animal Kingdom opening Saturday, with the other parks to follow next week. In South Korea, Park Woo-soon, the mayor of the capital of Seoul and potential South Korean presidential candidate, has been found dead a day after going missing and calling his daughter to leave a will. It also came out the day before that he went missing. A woman came forward with a sexual harassment accusation. Legislatures in the Philippines have voted to keep the country's top broadcaster, ABS-CBN, off the air, with an overwhelming majority of the parliament saying the station was undeserving of a 25-year license, which the station needs to keep broadcasting. Critics of the company said it represented the country's rich and powerful, whereas Western commentators are criticizing this move as a shutdown to press freedom. New York Post is saying, quote, accused Jeffrey Epstein fixer Ghislaine Maxwell has been forced to wear paper clothes and sleep on a bare mattress in her jail cell so she can't hang herself with clothes or bed sheets like Epstein, according to the report. Authorities at the Federal Bureau of Prisons have been assigned to ensure that Maxwell does not kill herself and is not harmed by other inmates while she is jailed at the BOP Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, a source told the Associated Press. And with that, you are all caught up. Fault lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So, Shane, fault lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So the one I want to talk to, there are two that I want to discuss. And we may not have time for both. Epstein, Maxwell, and paper clothes, the socialite going into down paper clothes so she wouldn't off herself because of Maxwell offing himself. And they're thinking that if he potentially offed himself, well, we need to make sure you don't. So she is basically catching flack from the previous scenario. But also this ruling dealing with the Supreme Court and Neil and Gersh. I would imagine that many of the people in Trump's administration, or for that matter, many conservatives might think this guy's a traitor. I think this is awesome. He's going with a strict interpretation of the Constitution of sorts and basically saying, look, these guys were forced to leave from Georgia and Alabama. The Creek Nation received assurances. Well, you're going to hold up to your assurances. And with a weirdly conservative interpretation of this, basically said bare bones of it is, yeah, it's their ruling, it's their land. Now, my heart blows up over there like, whoa! And I have to ask myself, is it possible, to any degree that's possible, that all of these people who've been protesting, pushing, marching for these, a new revamping, a hegemonic norm in regards to the way we see ourselves in this nation and the way we recognize the experiences and reality of other people, other groups that weren't necessarily the dominant force in this nation. Once we start recognizing those things, is it possible, to any degree that's possible, that those protests actually made its way, in some part, to Neil Gersh's heart? I mean, this is phenomenal, right? What do you think about this? I was blown away by this when we were discussing this the other day.
Yeah, no, this is a landmark ruling, quote unquote. That's kind of the thing that people are saying about it. This is huge in the context, obviously, of like Native American relations with America. You're asking, I think, an interesting question. I would actually flip that question though. You were asking what effects have the protests had on this ruling. I would say what effects is this ruling going to have on the protests? In other words, this is a big coup in sort of one of the deep existential American issues, our relationships with the people who lived in America before we came here. There's also the question of how big of a ruling actually is this. So this has to do with people who are being prosecuted in criminal courts. Basically, it's just changing the jurisdiction criminally. As far as I can tell, it'd probably have some implications on things like property, but it's not like everybody who was living in Oklahoma is suddenly now, either have to get out or they're going to have to dramatically change, most of their lives. I don't think it's going to be anything like that. But this is another way to look at this. This was over 100 years, well over 100 years that this had been signed, that the wording was unclear, that they now had to revise it. That's a sort of very deep place to go. If you're willing to go back and make changes on that, something that deep in the historical record. Again, it's not many hundreds of years, but still in the context of America, that's a pretty big jump for the length of our history. So that's interesting. And just the sort of force of that, especially what I'm guessing the public opinion about this is going to be a little bit more than actually happened. Again, like we were just saying, it might not be as significant as we first thought it would, but if the public sees it as really significant, if it affects how people are thinking about these issues in a fundamental way, another way to look at this, there seems to be a long-term, how to put this? There's a sea change in events. There's a sort of constant, deeper pressure that's building and moving things in this abstract sense. While that may be true, we've seen a lot of sort of higher up, really big movements happening pretty quickly when it comes to the culture, when it comes to this decision, even the conversation about reparations. Again, Marianne Williamson, that would have been a pretty hot button issue for everybody to bring up. Marianne Williamson came in the 2020 election. Pretty early on, she was talking about this stuff, and that seemed to have shifted the Overton window on these issues. And so again, what does this mean for America? What does this mean for the people living in America? That's, I think, that's the thing that really interests me. What is that gonna do to our self-conception, to our ability to act on that self-conception, that whole thing? That's an open question. And for America, that's the existential question, I would argue. That's prior to all these other things. If you know who you are, if you know what you can do, then in some sense you have a foundation on which you can act. And because we've been lacking that as a country, I think, because the foundation was either crumbling from the start or has been degraded over time, arguably both of those are true, there's a real opportunity here to come back together and to do something with it. That's my personal little patriotic take. I'll hand it back over to you, Jamarl.
No, I think that's a good take. I mean, it's nuanced, right? Like, we're looking at a situation where, look, there's nothing in me that looks at our world and think, we need to find a vampire that was living back during that time to punch in the stomach over slavery. I don't think that at all. I don't even think that way in terms of, from a standpoint of the Native American issue. In real terms, it's a quirk of reality that we end up in one person or it's an artifact of a quirk of nature that we end up in one body or another. But I do think that there are vestiges of history that go along with that stuff that get really interesting when you start to interrogate whether or not you want to resolve those things and whether those things need to be resolved at all. And what does it mean to move forward? And I think moving forward, believe it or not, means to some degree moving backwards. It's starting, because look, we're in a situation where we need to reconcile certain issues that have taken place in our country. Donald Trump, when he was giving that speech recently, he was on Lakota land. That land was supposed to be theirs by treaty, I think Treaty 1868, if I'm not mistaken, but was basically removed the moment that they found gold. And they was like, yeah, you guys need to go. There's gold on their hills. Well, that's a horrible track record. And even in the pushback against this, what was his argument? The argument basically became, well, this is going to have certain consequences that are going to extend, that may be more important than the case itself. And it's like, well, wait a minute. Your job is not necessarily to evaluate whether or not the consequences are going to extend beyond the case. Your job is to evaluate the merits of the case. And in this very particular case, they came out with merits of the case that basically said, yeah, for the purpose of this case, the Native Americans win this case. I was shocked by that. Happy, but shocked by it. And like you said, I don't know what it means entirely. And so we're going to get into kind of a discussion about what that means at like 8:15. Let's get into Kanye West, because we got into an interesting conversation on the Kanye West thing. So make your pitch about Kanye.
I'll do it. And here's the thing. This is going to be sort of a longer term conversation. We only have a few minutes to do this, and about 40 seconds of that is going to be this clip. I'll just set this clip up real quick. We were having a conversation yesterday, Jamarl, Brendan, and I, Raheem and I, keep getting that wrong, having a conversation about a bunch of different stuff. We started talking about Kanye West. And I'll put it like this. I think he's going to be, we'll see how this goes. I think he's going to be a viable political candidate in terms of if he runs, picking up a number of votes, making an impact on how American politics views itself, like a viable political candidate in the real political sense, changing how power works in the United States. I think there's a real strong case to be made for that. Now, what you were saying was basically you didn't think he was serious about it. You thought he might not go through on it. Even if he went through, it's not like there are going to be people voting for him. We'll see about that. One thing real quick, though, I want to get to this clip. It's not a campaign ad, but I kind of see it as such. It's like the inkling of a campaign ad. He did this voter registration ad where he went, where he lives in Cody, Wyoming. He went down to get registered to vote. He showed people what information you need to put on your form to get registered to vote. And then he got into a conversation with the clerk there about the problems in the local voting system. And I thought this was really interesting. We can talk about it after we play it, but Andre, let's play that clip first.
So it's a lot of people who think they can't vote because they're a convicted felon, but they actually can ask for their rights back.
Yep.
Why do some other states make it so complicated to vote?
Well, the statutes are set up by legislature. So the people that they've elected to the House of Representatives and senators are the ones that set up, they have bills, they set up those statutes.
How do we get that changed in the states where it is made extremely complicated?
I think it starts with legislature. They have to get the statutes for each state changed. it's not uniform all the way across. Each state
How do I
has their
get-
own way of doing things and the way they work through the process.
And that's the clip. So that's, again, it's a little bit bland, it's a little bit boring. But I just want to point out, what is he doing here? A really huge media personality who says he's planning on running for president went down, showed people how to sign up to vote, and then talked to the clerk and asked the clerk for advice on how the system works and what he would do if he were going to change it on that grassroots level. That's a different kind of political activity and a different kind of political engagement than I have ever seen. And that's why I'm kind of excited, even though there's a lot of stuff that you can be afraid about, even though you should be like, okay, is this the guy to talk to? Well, in some sense, maybe this is the guy to talk to. Maybe that's where you start the conversation, is on the ground level with somebody who has to do this every day instead of with some politician who has to talk about it all day long. That's my brief take. What's yours, Jamarl?
We're going to have to take a break. But let's talk about this at the next headlines one, because I think this deserves a longer and more thought out conversation between the both of us.
Fair
enough.
Let's do it.
So let's come back. We're going to have Joe Laurie with us for a talk about the Supreme Court Eastern Oklahoma Native American ruling. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. President Kanye.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines, we divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back
we
to
are
Fault
back.
Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm here with Shane Stranahan. We were having a conversation on the Kanye ruling, and we were having a conversation on the Kanye ruling. If you guys are in the DC area, you can pick us up at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. Also, if you are in Kansas City, we are also kicking it at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. So we were having a conversation about Kanye West. And you were saying that you believe that Kanye was going to be that he might actually be legitimate about it, that he may be real about doing this. I have massive qualms or massive doubts that Kanye West is going to participate in the political process. And if he does, that he is going to get even one black vote. Now, I'm being hyperbolic when I say that. He may get a small amount, but I think liberals are putting more emphasis on him than I think is due or that is legit. Because basically what it boils down to is a person who's walking around with a Trump hat, who acted like Trump was his dad at one point, his white dad. That guy is now saying, okay, now I'm going to run for office and I'm running against Trump. And I don't necessarily know how many people are going to believe it. But we are joined, and we're going to pick this conversation back up at the 9:15 or 9 o'clock hour. But we're joined by Joe Laurie, SCOTUS. We're going to talk about the SCOTUS ruling. Joe Laurie is editor-in-chief at Consortium News, a political commentator, and author of How I Lost by Hillary Clinton. I love that, by Hillary Clinton. Joe, welcome to the show. How's it going, man?
I'm fine. How are you doing, Jamal? Good to hear from you guys.
Oh, absolutely. I'm doing all right. This is, I guess, the How I Lost by Hillary Clinton puts me in mind of what happened. Hillary Clinton's own book by that title. So, Joe, I wanted to have a conversation about the Supreme Court ruling. And we were going through this ruling yesterday, and I was reading through it, and listening to Gorish's statement is amazing that Gorish, a right-winger, is basically arguing, look, this wasn't elucidated in the context of by Congress, and so the Constitution is what the Constitution is. You got to follow with the law. It's theirs. Now, what does this ruling mean in real-world terms?
Well, that's a good question, because I think that there's been some really awful reporting on this and a lot of confusion. Gorsuch was simply saying that Congress had, in fact, never removed the status of that part of Oklahoma East as a reservation. And Chief Justice Roberts said, in fact, this Congress was very clear. I'm going to just quote from Roberts if I can, that he said it's very clear that the Congress never withdrew the promised reservation. So that's what Gorsuch said. In other words, the issue here is whether this is remains a reservation or whether it becomes part of Oklahoma, the state of Oklahoma. Now, there's some screaming headlines and some very distorted reporting that I want to get into, but essentially, this only applies to the application of state law in that part of Oklahoma. In other words, federal law continues to rule there. And it only applies to state laws being enforced in that part of Oklahoma and only involving Native Americans. I'm going to give you this USA Today report begins by saying that the Supreme Court said that the eastern half of Oklahoma can be considered Native American territory, a decision the state warned would create, quote, civil, criminal, and regulatory turmoil. And then they give you a link to an article that says 1 in 3 American Indian and Alaska Native women will be raped, but survivors rarely find justice. That link has to do with the fact that this case that the Supreme Court was deciding on was an appeal from a man named Jim C. McGirt, a Native American, who says that his state rape conviction should be overturned because Oklahoma lacked jurisdiction. So this was just a question of who has jurisdiction over his case and cases involving only Native Americans, where USA Today is saying that this that the tribal law will affect all of eastern Oklahoma, including Tulsa, where Trump had his rally last year. That is so misleading to say that it makes it seem like that Native Americans will now rule all of eastern Oklahoma, and this was about a rape case, and American Indian women get raped. 1 out of 3 get raped, and they rarely find justice on tribal lands. It's such an outrageous reporting of this story to make it seem like that now Native Americans rule the eastern half, and that women who will get raped and they'll never get justice. In fact, it's a really overblown story, Jamal. It really is only about whether this is still a reservation or not. The Supreme Court decided it was, and that the state, it doesn't have jurisdiction over Native Americans on state crimes only, not federal crimes. This is really an overblown story, in my opinion.
Interesting. So what does that mean for the standpoint of prosecutions? Is that trying to say that the reservation has jurisdiction over any kind of prosecutions in that territory? Is that what that means?
No, only for state crimes. In other words, if someone commits a federal crime or can be convicted under a federal law, then that remains, nothing has changed. If someone is convicted under a state law, and that someone happens to be a Native American, he is now subject to Native American law and Native American trials and justice system, not the state.
But the regular Native, but people who are white or people who are black or people who are just basic Americans in the traditional sense.
Totally unaffected by the Supreme Court ruling.
That's
absolutely
significant.
Unaffected.
That's the significant part, and you're right. That hasn't been just to back you up there. We were talking about that. We were getting that wrong earlier, and the reason is, like you're saying, that part hasn't been reported nearly widely enough.
It's not surprising you'd be confused, because when I read this USA Today story, that was extremely confusing and even very discriminatory against Native Americans and alarmist in its reporting. And I wonder if the reporters even understood what this ruling was about. Now, of course, Justice Roberts says that it's a state, it's not a reservation, which is an extremely right-wing reactionary point of view. That even on issues that only revolve around state law and only Native Americans, that the Native American tribes and their legal system have no jurisdiction. That's what Roberts is saying, which is outrageous. Of course, this court is simply saying that the tribal lands have a jurisdiction over their own people when it comes to their laws and not the state. But when it's federal, it's federal. It's similar somewhat to Sharia law, which became some outrageously distorted and hysterical issue a couple of years ago in particular, may still be. Sharia law is practiced in some states in the U.S. only for Muslims and only on family matters. But there was this cry that Sharia law is going to be applied to the whole country. Some absurdity. This is very similar to that. This only applies to Native Americans under Native American law on the reservation, not to all people in eastern Oklahoma. Now, of course, the New York Times, in a way, couched it that this is in the context of the uprisings we've seen. Begun, of course, by the George Floyd murder, which has expanded to other issues, including Native American rights. We saw that come to a head in Mount Rushmore when Trump went there. So, yes, I think that maybe the spirit of, the Redskins controversy there in Washington is certainly part of this, that people are now, paying attention to these issues that have been buried for too long and ignored, and that this is a rare opportunity to make some real serious reforms, including changing sports teams' names, so that the Times couched its reporting of this decision by the Supreme Court in that context. And there might be something to it, but I think that it's so narrow, this decision, that it's could have come even without the uprising. This decision by the court 5-4 to allow the Native American tribes to apply law to their own people on what is still a reservation for those purposes, not for federal law and not for non-Native Americans who live in the reservation, quote unquote reservation, which it still legally is, but only affects Native Americans on things that the state could try them for, not federal laws.
So if it was, say, for example, a Native American commits a crime during the reservation, but the crime is committed against a person who's not part of the reservation, whose law is applicable?
That's a very good question. I would think that it would be the tribal law because of who the suspect is, who's being tried, not the victim. But that's a very good question. That didn't come up. I don't know how that would be decided.
That's fascinating. That's utterly and entirely fascinating that they would make a ruling like this. If I'm curious, so you don't think, my thought was that part of this had to do with the reasoning or the rationale was couched within the context of everything that was going on, meaning with all of the people in the streets and everything else. That's the way I was looking at this. Like, my thought was, all right, there's a hegemonic shift that has taken place in the way that America reconciles itself, kind of like for example, colored, or using the term Negro. That both of those things were perfectly permissible. Then at a certain point, it's like, oh, that's a little dicey. We don't want to be this people anymore. The difference is, I think we're in the middle of it, and we're seeing it as it takes place. So it has this kind of very weird, disorienting effect associated with it. What do you think this goes? I mean, what do you think this ultimately ends up in regards to all of the protests, all of the people who are out on the streets? What does this look like, let's say, in several months? And does this mature into something else that's a broader attack on the system itself?
Well, as I said, this decision by the Supreme Court may or may not have had anything to do with the uprisings and the new focus on issues revolving around Native Americans. But it could be interpreted that way, and it is being interpreted that way. So it's seen as a victory in that sense. But again, I don't know if it came about from the pressure that's being exerted by the public, by protesters, by Native American leaders. But I think that the fact that it is going to be interpreted that way is probably a good thing. I think we're going to see a new name for the football team in Washington, for example. And I think that we might see other rulings that could apply to other reservations around the country. This had to do with Oklahoma, but I think other states that have the same issue will be affected by this ruling in some way. So it's definitely a progressive, but I'm just trying to downplay it because I think it's being overblown by its importance, both negatively and positively. Positively, that this was a great victory for the protest movement, and negatively that this is outrageous because Native Americans are going to rule over everybody in eastern Oklahoma, which is basically the end of the. Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. I was just going to say, within the context of, I shouldn't have combined the two. You're right. But if you were just looking at from the protests, from the people who are on the streets, from these changes that seem to be taking place, in the 30, 45 seconds that we have remaining, what do you think this turns out to be, if it turns out to be anything, meaning from our society as a whole?
I think I think one thing, I don't know if it'll have any effect whatsoever beyond what it means for eastern Oklahoma, but we shouldn't forget how those native tribes got to Oklahoma. As you know, they were kicked out of Georgia and Alabama, and they were made to walk all the way to Oklahoma, which was called Indian Territory at that time. And that was supposed to be where they finally solved this issue, what to do with the Native Americans. And we'll throw them there. And then, of course, there's a long history of treaties being broken, obviously. And here's a case where at least the Supreme Court stood up for a basic understanding that that's still reservation, that it still belongs to Native Americans, but only in the narrow instance of where a Native American is going to be charged, not for a non-federal crime. The Native Americans can deal with their own people. It's a victory, but it's unfortunately not as big as it should have been or could be, and it doesn't erase the ugly history of how Oklahoma came about to begin with.
And with that, we're going to leave it. That's Joe Laurie. He's the editor-in-chief at Consortium News, a political commentator and author of How I Lost by Hillary Clinton. Joe, thank you for coming on to the show. We'll be back in a moment. This is Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here.
Real opinions for real people.
So where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out,
we actually let them expand on their views.
What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well.
And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.